Hello and welcome back to another Rush Duel Links deck profile. Today we're taking a look at Maximum Overload and our new maximum monster, Supreme Machine Magnum Overlord, which I think a lot of people would agree is probably the deck people expect the least amount from. They're not expecting this deck to really pop off. I think this deck, it can really punish a lot of plays, but overall the deck ends up feeling, I don't want to say inconsistent, but it doesn't feel great, and we'll get into why that is in a minute. So first thing we'll do is talk about the skill, because this both is its consistency tool but also doesn't really do enough for what the main game plan is, and we'll talk about that a little bit in a sec. But Maximum Overload, this skill can be used if the only monsters with 2100 or less attack in your deck are spellcaster type or machine type. Now this is a bit of a mistranslation. Basically what this skill does is you can only use monsters in your deck that have 2100 or less attack, full stop. And those monsters have to be spellcasters and machines. So we can't play 2500 attack monsters. We can't do non-spellcasters, non-machines. I saw some people saying you'd be able to play like Dragius with this and stuff. No, you cannot do that. We have to only play 2100 attack or less, and they have to be spellcasters and machines. Requirement: send a maximum monster from your hand to the graveyard. Now you might be wondering, that sounds a bit weird, but we can place one monster from our hand onto the field in face-down defense position. Its battle position can be changed. So this means we can basically cheat out a monster face down defense, then choose to flip it up if we want it, so we can have it in face up attack or face down defense. Then you can decrease the attack of one face up monster on your opponent's field by 800 until the end of this turn. During the end phase of this turn, return one maximum monster in your graveyard to the top of your deck. So what this means is we basically take a maximum piece from our hand and put it on top of our deck. Kind of. Like slowly, that's how we do it. Which is a good way to keep the maximum pieces around without them having clogged up your hand. But at the same time, it doesn't really make any difference between whether you put it on the top of your deck or whether you just leave it in your hand floating. So it's a bit weird from that kind of viewpoint. But what this does do is allow the rest of your deck to really pop off. Being able to cheat out something like a 7's Rogue Magician can be really, really good. Being able to weaken one of your opponent's monsters by 800 attack, again, can be really, really good in kind of a situation where you only have 2100 or lower attack monsters. So it does allow the rest of the deck to really beat your opponent down. It doesn't really help facilitate maximum summoning. Now, the one primary interesting thing about this is we don't have to put the maximum monster that we discard back on top of our deck. So we can use this to fix our maximum, as it were. Let's say we've got two mid pieces in our graveyard, but we have a left and a right in hand. We could discard a left and then get back one of the mid pieces back on top of our deck, which, when assuming we have more like other pieces in our deck, we can draw into it and have a higher chance of seeing the maximum. So overall, the skill is pretty cool. The limitations on the skill, restricting us to only use 2100 or less attack monsters, and they have to be spellcasters and machines, is very limiting, and that restriction is why I think this deck is being held back a little bit. So let's go over the actual boss monster of the deck, the Supreme Machine Magnum Overlord. You can maximum summon this card together with the other pieces. While it's in maximum mode, it cannot be destroyed by trap cards, as well as if your life points are lower than your opponent's, you can send one card from your hand to the graveyard, gain the difference in attack points. And then the other one is this card gains attack equal to the level of one face-up monster on your opponent's field times 200. So if they have a level 7 monster, which is going to be the most likely, it will gain 1400 attack. If they have a maximum, it will gain 2000 attack, etc, etc. So that's our boss monster. The main goal is to try and get this guy down and try and kill your opponent in that turn. And why do we have to kill our opponent in that turn? Because this deck is not super great at dealing with your opponent just putting everything in defense mode. We do have some stuff we can do with that, such as Tauner, but in that scenario, what we kind of need to do is tribute over our Supreme Machine Magnum Overlord with a Tauner, discard a card to flip one of our opponent's monsters face up, and then summon a brand new maximum over our Tauner, and then attack in that way, and that's very awkward. Now, we could play other cards in this deck to try and facilitate that, things like Pierce, or we could play something like Stop Defense, but most of the time, those cards don't actually come up as being particularly useful, so including them does feel a little bit of a waste, on top of the fact that Magnum Overlord can actually be outed in so many ways, and the most prevalent of which is probably Talismanic Seal Array, with the next most common way being the new Legend spell card, Tribute to the Doomed. And having access to either of these, which a lot of decks are just running these cards, basically makes our Magnum Overlord a bit of a liability, because it will lose 2000 attack or just immediately be destroyed. Having a 1500 monster as your only monster, which can easily get attacked over, destroyed, and then attack basically 2 direct attacks, can just end the game on the spot. So summoning out Machine Magnum Overlord early oftentimes actually loses you the game, so you have to be really, really careful with how you play it. The next kind of almost real boss monster of the deck is Seven's Rogue Magician. Seven's Rogue Magician is obviously just always going to be a fantastic boss. It can boost its own attack up by quite a bit, as well as the fact that with the skill we can reduce our opponent's monster's attack by 800, which means we can get in for a decent chunk. As well as the Magician's Valkyria, which is actually an okay statted monster. 1800 defense does actually come up more often than you'd think, and 1600 attack is kind of just fine. Next up, we have Torna the Wind Weaver. Now, Torna the Wind Weaver is the only other high-level monster we're playing, and arguably, you could say, oh, you should be playing more because of the skill. But because the skill requires us to discard a card, that's the exact same as if we were to just normal summon a monster and then tribute over it for level 6. So we only actually get really good value off of it if we're summoning out the Seven's Rogue Magician. Otherwise, it's just kind of not doing too much. It's not any different from just playing the game regularly, and the skill would just basically reduce our opponent's monster's attack by 800, which is still fine. But Torna is a very important part of the deck because this lets us change battle positions, which is how sometimes we'll be winning the game, sometimes we'll change problematic attack by monsters into defense mode. Torna does kind of do a little bit of everything we need, and it is a wind monster, which does help with the Seven's Rogue Magician effect. Next up, we have Light Sorcerer of Sanctity. Again, this card is completely crazy. It's been really, really good ever since it came out. Pay 300 life points, one face-up monster on your opponent's field, loses attack equal to the number of face-up light attribute spellcaster monsters on your field times 300 until the end of this turn. And that is just really big. If we get out multiple light spellcasters, which we are playing 6 of them between the Light Sorcerer, the Magician's Valkyria, and the Light Sorcerer of Sanctity, we could reduce our opponent's monsters by 600 or 900. If we get 3 copies of Light Sorcerer of Sanctity out, we could reduce a monster by up to 2700 attack points, which is absolutely huge. And this again does come up, being able to weaken our opponent's monster's attack over them. Sometimes we will get our opponent just low enough that we can just about finish them off, and this is the perfect way to do it. As well as the fact, if we're planning to make a Magnum Overlord play, this will reduce our opponent's monster attack as well as reducing our life points, which increases the amount of attack that Magnum Overlord will gain by an additional 300, and that does sometimes all add up. Then we have Mystic Dealer. Mystic Dealer is really, really good because, again, we want to be discarding cards and drawing cards. We want to be finding our maximum pieces as often as we can. Mystic Dealer is the best way to do it, as well as the fact it is a water spellcaster monster, which is, again, really good for Seven's Rogue Magician. And then the Light Sorcerer is in here as beta, as well as the fact it could be used with Light Sorcerer Sanctity, and that's kind of it. For our spell cards, we are on 2 copies of Magical Stream. Now, Magical Stream is in here basically to deal with your opponent's back row most of the time, because the way that we usually win games is beat down using Seven's Rogue Magician, so getting rid of those pesky widespread ruins is very, very important. But on top of that, your opponent will oftentimes set their important spell cards to get them out of their hands so they can draw up to 5 on the following turn, which means we can use Magical Stream to get rid of those cards. Hitting your opponent's Tribute to the Doomed has saved me so many times, so Magical Stream, really, really good. Then we have Monster Reincarnation, and this again is really, really important for a multitude of reasons. We can fix our maximum and just summon it out. We can get back Seven's Rogue Magician and just win the game off of that. We can also use it to get back Torna, which occasionally does come up and will win you the game by changing your opponent's battle position if your opponent's low and you can't quite just finish them off. So again, for maximum decks, Monster Reincarnation is always going to be fantastic. Then we have Talismanic Seal Array. Now this is a card, before we put this in the deck, our win rate was about 55%, something along that. After we put this card in our deck, our win rate skyrocketed. Talismanic Seal Array really does help this deck. Being able to chuck a load of stuff back in the deck can be really, really useful, as well as the fact that a lot of the time we got to the point we could get our opponent really, really low, but not quite finish them off, and Talismanic Seal Array lets us do that, as well as the fact it lets us out maximums, even if we don't have our Magnum Overlord, which is very, very important. Talismanic Seal Array, fantastic card at the moment. And then finally, we have the Widespread Ruin. Now, this is the only trap card we're playing because we're a little bit tight on spell trap space, but this is obviously still the best trap card. It does not work against maximums, but it works against everything else. And even decks that do maximum summon will be attacking with non-maximum monsters in some regard. The Cyburst deck will still be using the other Cyburst boss monster to try and attack you. The Seven's Rogue Magician will be attacking in our deck, and in the Harpy Lady deck, that deck is mostly not maximums, and therefore Widespread Ruin still works really well against that, even though they can play around it. So this is the deck. This deck is weird. It's strangely consistent in the fact that we don't usually brick too hard because we can discard some of our maximum pieces, be that Overlord or either of the left or right pieces, to get out our higher level monsters, which means the deck doesn't brick in the traditional way that a deck bricks, which makes it feel kind of consistent. But at the same time, the deck doesn't actually summon out the maximum as often as I would like, so it ends up feeling inconsistent. So the deck overall feels kind of consistent, but actually maximum summoning feels inconsistent, which is very weird and feels very unintuitive. And that's another problem with this deck, is just it feels unintuitive, right? a lot of the time we will find all 3 pieces of our maximum early, but we don't want to summon it. And so it puts us in this really weird predicament of, if we summon out our max, it's now a liability, it can be outed very easily, and that's now 3 less pieces that we have to try and summon it later on in the game when we want to actually close out the game. But if we don't, then we're in a weird predicament where do we just hold on to all 3 cards? We can send 1 to the graveyard with our skill and cheat something out, but then what do we do with the others? Do we keep them in hand? And if we have spell and traps as well, it complicates things because now we've only got like 1 monster on the field. It's a very awkward deck, and it can feel very obtuse to play, but it still can kill your opponent out of nowhere. Being able to just gain a ton of attack is really, really good and can just absolutely destroy your opponent. One of the weirdest matchups we have for this is the mirror. The mirror match for this deck is very strange because either you go all out aggro and just hope your opponent doesn't just rip their maximum, or you play this weird staring contest where you're like, okay, I need to get you low enough that I can kill you eventually, but not low enough that you can boost over with your maximum and kill me. So it becomes this weird, like, managing you and your opponent's life, managing the board, managing the cards in your deck, and trying to find a way that you can kill your opponent with some sort of 7's Row Magician Torna play without having to rely on the maximum at all. And it gets very awkward, especially if both of you have 3 back row down, because then you have to play around something like Widespread Ruin. And it gets very messy and very slow. So again, you have the 2 options. You either play that kind of weird, slow back and forth, or you play all out aggression, just hope they don't rip the max. Because that is the thing. Maximums can be very luck-based, especially in this deck, where oftentimes we end up holding 1 piece in hand, and then we just keep stacking one of the other pieces to the top of our deck, and then we're just hoping to draw into that last piece. So because we've got 1 piece in hand and 1 piece on the top of our deck that we know we're drawing, we only draw 3 other cards, so we have to hope that that 1 in 3 is the other piece that we need. And that does happen enough that the deck can feel playable, but it doesn't feel like it happens enough that the deck can feel really, really strong and really, really like top tier. So overall, my rating for this deck is, it's pretty cool. If you're lucky, it can completely destroy your opponent. It feels relatively consistent, which is quite nice. And it does actually have an okay matchup into the Royal Rebel deck, but not a perfect one, especially because Royal Rebels actually have a trap card that can just stop an attack in the King's Majesty, which basically does give the Royal Rebels an extra tool to actually stop you from killing them, which is a bit weird, because on one hand, the Royal Rebel deck usually will kind of blow up your board, hit you for a chunk of damage, and not straight up kill you unless they get like a big heavy metal turn. But they also have the extra tool to deal with you that no other deck has in the King's Majesty. So it's awkward, but it's an interesting matchup at the very least. So this is the deck. Again, I don't know if I would recommend this deck if you're planning to try and, let's say, win a tournament, or if you're trying to get like a crazy high win streak, but this deck is definitely fine for ladder, it's definitely fine for cogging, and it is a lot of fun. So let's find some replays so I can show you what I've been talking about.
やらんことラッシュデュエルラッシュデュエル行くよラッシュデュエルいつでもどうぞ。 ラッシュデュエル いくよラッシュデュエル